Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is real briefly some history. In 2003, in December, Ruby 1.8 came out. Previous versions of Ruby, all even-numbered versions were production releases, and odd-numbered versions were development versions. So 1.7 was never released for anything but benchmarking and development. Ruby 1.6 had been in use for years at that point. A lot of code had been written in it, very little of it with English documentation. The Pragmatic Programmer's book came out, the first edition of it, in Ruby 1.6, and so we had this brief period of time for most of 2004 where all of the documentation that was available in English was in Ruby 1.6, and all of the code everyone was writing and passing around was Ruby 1.8. It was like that for over a year. Widespread adoption of Ruby 1.8 really comes about around the same time as Rails comes on the scene, which is 2005. So those of us who were using Ruby at that time and who didn't speak Japanese, and yes, all of us could have fit in this room, but we struggled. You had to really go to the Ruby source code and the C-level APIs and read through them in order to kind of figure these things out. Fortunately, people like Dave Thomas did spend the time to dig through all of that stuff and brought us, an excellent book talking about everything that was there, and we were able to move forward. So where are we now? Well, really, December of last year, 2008, Ruby 1.9, which had been in development for some time, hit the scene. They'd broken away from that model of odds and evens. The discussions for that came around the same time as the Linux kernel development went away from that model. So what's it going to take? Is it going to be another year and a half? Is it going to be some other major event that really drives us to 1.9? How are we as a community going to transition and move forward? As you heard from the last presentation, there's a lot of benefit to moving forward. But so why doesn't everyone just jump over, right? Well, we have one of these problems, right? See, as a developer, I don't want to try and maintain all of my gems in Ruby 1.9 if I'm not using Ruby 1.9. But I won't move to Ruby 1.9 until the majority of the gems that I use from other people work in Ruby 1.9. So I don't move my code forward, no one moves their code forward, and we all just kind of talk about how great 1.9 is going to be someday. And that's why it took a year and a half to move from 1.6 really to 1.8. It just was a really slow process of porting code, finding maintainers who had kind of wandered off and done other things, getting projects switched over, and there's this huge portion of code. I don't know if any of you have ever searched for something in Ruby on Google and ended up on the RIAA site, the old, the predecessor to Ruby Gems. Basically, it was the system we had for bundling and distributing libraries before Ruby Gems came about. And there's code there that never made the jump to 1.8. Now, pretty much everyone has gone from 1.6 to 1.8 now. There were 2 people at RubyConf this last year that still had a couple 1.6 production systems that they were using for things. But, we finally moved on. We don't want to take that much time and have this much, much larger community suffer the same way. So maybe there's an alternative. And my proposal for the alternative is the Ruby 1.9 or Bust project. Basically, the idea is that the knowledge it takes to move a library from working on 1.8 to working on 1.9 is fairly specialized. Hopefully a year from now, no one will care about that knowledge ever again, right? We'll have the majority of what we need, and, I feel like every developer out there that's using Ruby or maintaining a Ruby library doesn't necessarily need to go through the pain of learning those things. As we saw with the blocks and with the string changes, there are some really subtle things that you need to know to look out for when you're checking code over to see if it's going to work in 1.9 or not. So far, I've moved 4 different libraries over. 2 of them had really, really subtle bugs that did not show up in the RSpec. And one of them had to do with the hash ordering. and one of them had to do with that block syntax. So I guess I feel like we don't necessarily need to distribute that knowledge to everyone. I mean, it's definitely freely available, but there's a lot of work in learning what all the subtle changes are. So the idea behind this project is to raise money similar to the Ruby Mendicant project that we did last year as a community that paid for Jeffrey, or is that right? Yeah, to focus on rewriting a decent Ruby PDF library. It's called Prawn. And to be able to have me focus on converting as many gems as I can and basically shepherding through, tracking down the maintainers of these packages, getting new official versions released, solving the GitHub problem of, maybe there's a 1.9 compatible branch of this somewhere, but who knows if it's got other subtle changes in it that are for that particular user. Who knows if it's ever going to make it back into the main line. So I feel like we need someone who's just an advocate that is shepherding those things through the process, is helping developers, make changes to their own libraries, and helping, make every gem that's still in major use. I mean, there is some code that's going to be deprecated and we don't really need, right? But everything that's in major use, we should have available on Ruby 1.9. And I'd really like to see, my personal goal, is that at RubyConf this year in November, we can all talk about how, oh yeah, I moved everything over to 1.9 and it's great. So that's my pitch. And then there's a website where you can kind of learn more about my plan. You can vote about how I pick which gems I want to do, and you can donate if you choose to. That's it. Anybody have any questions? I can show you. Well, I can kind of show you. I can show you how many gems there are on RubyForge. I have not counted them, but it's a lot. Well, I guess it tells us right here there are 7,530 projects on RubyForge. Presumably not all of those need to come over, right? Yeah, and a lot of them are not active. It would be awesome if RubyForge could search for only projects that have released code. You go to a Ruby project, you're like, oh, this is perfect. This is exactly the library I need. And there's no code, no website. Somebody had a good idea and did, launched it. So, and we can see here the second most active project, the Seattle RB projects. There are quite a few gems in that one project. So this isn't, super scientific. But as we scroll down here, we see there are pages and pages. And again, this doesn't count any of the stuff that's only on GitHub that never made it up to RubyForge. So really, if your gem is in serious usage, you're still distributing it through the master version through RubyForge, I would say, at this point. That's changing. But at the moment, we're seeing there's a lot more scroll bar over here.
Do you have a sense of how much the majority will?
Yeah, this is the site I was talking about. I've already raised $300 for this project, which is awesome, especially since that's at $200 this morning. That's kind of exciting. So one thing that I have here is a poll here where after I describe what the project is, where you can talk about how I pick which gems to work on. So far, let's look at the results real quick. We see that starting with Rails and working our way down to getting as many of the full stacks working as possible is kind of the most popular idea. It kind of makes sense to me because Rails developers outweigh other Ruby developers by a really substantial margin. So I imagine that's where we'll end up on. There is isitruby19.com, and that's a possible source for information. One of the things I am committed to doing is updating any project that I do work on so that it reflects it there. So that as people are going through and saying, what is and what isn't. It's sort of unfortunate, but the gem specification doesn't have a which version of Ruby does this work on line in it. That's not an option. And I talked a little bit about patching it to do that, and it was not super popular. So basically what I'm saying is being able to specify in the gem itself whether it works on Ruby 1.9 or not, it wasn't met with a great reception. So basically because it's a temporal thing, and they don't want to add even more complexity to an already complex beast for something that's not going to be an issue with, I think the quote was in 6 months. Now, honestly, I think it would be awesome if it wasn't an issue in 6 months, but I think that's a little, that's even more optimistic than my optimistic approach, right?
Would that minimum Rails version require a thing?
But yeah, if you're saying that, anyway. So those are kind of the ideas, and if you have a strong opinion about that, definitely come and vote about how I pick things. I'm totally open to suggestions. The other thing about the isitruby19.com is it's still really sparse. So even if you're not, interested in looking at the C-level APIs and what's changed there, or feel like you can really get into the guts of some of these things and make changes to them, just download, try, and report is a huge help. Knowing what's broken and where is a big thing. There are a lot of them that can just get greenlit. That just, oh yeah, that works, not a problem. But to do that, the steps really are download it, see if there are any specs, if there are, or tests. If there are, run them, see if they pass. If they don't pass, well then that's a big sign right there. If they do all pass, you kind of have to look at the code coverage and see what's covered and what's not. And basically what I've been doing is if the code coverage is pretty good but not perfect, I just go through and visually see, real quick, is that easy to test, and does it look like it has any potential gotchas? So far that's enabled me to go through them relatively quickly, but you're still talking about, a chunk of time to kind of download it, figure out what the dependencies are, trace through all those dependencies, make sure they all work. It's kind of a big tree, right? By the time you get to Rails, something like Rails, there are multiple possible sets of gems you could have installed as the underlying thing to make it work. And, we need to kind of push forward on this. So, anybody else? Yeah. I have started converting my own personal gems, basically in the meantime. I lay out I think a $3,000 starting goal, so that I can really, basically what I want to do is go down and say, okay, I'm going to take a hiatus from one of the projects I'm working on and work 20 hours a week on making this happen. But to do that, I need to know that I'm not going to go 1 week and then be done, right? So, but in the meantime, I'm committed on my own time to moving all of the gems that I maintain, which is 5 or 6, over and making sure they're all Ruby 1.9 compatible. There's one gem that needs to be basically completely rewritten in order to make it compatible. But for the most part, there are pretty minor changes. One thing I will honestly admit is over the years I have gotten in that bad habit of filling up my arrays.
I was going to suggest that you start a parking lot
I have nothing to say about that. I think Giles has time to deal with that. So.
That's gold chain.
Yeah.
I think everything I've written will break because of that.
Yeah. No, that's the most common thing, right? But the truth is, it's really easy to fix.
Yeah.
Right? Once you know about it, it's like, oh, okay, it's that problem again, done, and move on. But if you have to do that a couple hundred times in a library, the time starts to add up. So.
When you modify it, are they still compatible with 1.8?
Yeah. Yeah. There isn't anything that I run into so far that uses any of the C-level APIs that have changed. Like, for instance, the each versus each lines, the string in 1.8 supports each lines. Done. Right? It's completely backward compatible. There are a few really esoteric things that aren't backwards compatible at the C level, but there's very little code that uses those things, which is part of why they were changed.
So one thing I ran into is the bracket operator for access of the string. You say like, give a string to string 5, and Ruby 1.8 it returns the value, and the order value of the character. When Ruby 1.9 returns the character.
Yes.
That kind of stuff.
Well, I have to say it makes a hell of a lot more sense.
Yeah, it does.
Okay. That character value doesn't mean anything in UTF-8, right? If you have the potential of changing your strings to be multiple different encodings, like, that loses all value. So the only thing that makes sense to do at that point is to return the character. But yeah, that definitely is one place that gets broken. Now, you can still access the encoding value. And the change for that is backwards compatible, but it will definitely add a couple lines to your code. So, but yeah, there are a few little edge case things like that that are kind of gotchas that hide in there. So, you're using that a lot, aren't you?
No, well, I tried to make Grit Ruby 1.9 compatible, right? And unfortunately, that's like probably like I was like when I thought about it, I was like, this is actually terrible because they're like reading these strings and like essentially treating them like a C character array, right?
Mm-hmm. Which is what they are in Ruby 1.8.
Right, which is what they are, so that's good. But what really sucks is like when you go to 1.9, you really just want byte value and not even the character. I mean, it's like, I don't know. It's like the thing that I use is one pretty nasty hack if it works. But I mean, I don't even know if like all the tests at this point, but I'm sure that there might be some weird subtle things.
Yeah.
You know. Anyway, yeah, no, that came up a lot. That's why I
Yep.
know. And I knew that that was one of the cases where man, could they have put something in? Yeah, they could do it, but maybe not.
Well, there is. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's not that hard to get at that value.
It's not like board or something, but
Yeah.
I don't know. It turns out that it's board is defined on code or something. I don't know. Yeah, that's what I ended up doing. In a version of kind of way, which is it's horrible. Like defining a new method is essentially not cool.
Yeah, we definitely are going to need to maintain 1.8 backwards compatibility for a little while yet. It's not one of these cases where we can just charge blindly forward, but no, I really do think that Ruby 1.9 as a platform. If you wrote brand new code starting today, or you had code that didn't have any of these dependencies, then you would be able to run in production. It would be stable. It would be faster. It would be awesome. It's just a matter of getting everything else moved forward into that. So, yep.
What do you use for multi-version testing?
Basically what I have set up, and I'm still kind of working on perfecting this, is one of the things that's sort of subtle is some gems break only on Windows. So they'll work fine on the Mac, and then they don't work on Windows.
Just like Tuesdays.
Well, yeah, but yeah, only after the latest patches, right? So what I have set up is basically a set of Parallels images that I load up, and I run a Linux version. Basically, I'm just running a version of Ubuntu, because that seems to be what's the most, bang for your buck popularity-wise. And then a version of Windows, and then on the Mac. And then on my Mac, I have the Ruby 1.9 separate. So it's got that prefix, like you were seeing earlier. And but on the other two systems, it's installed as the only Ruby install. One really, really subtle thing that can drive you crazy, or at least can drive me crazy, is if you install Rake via Ruby gems on Ruby 1.9, okay, it doesn't prefix it, even if your Ruby install is prefixed. So then every time you run Rake anywhere else, it will try and run the Ruby 1.9 version of Rake. Does that make sense? No. Well, I mean, it isn't great, like it's bad, but, do you see how that could be a real pain in the butt? Because all of a sudden, like, You install a gem, a gem install, the gem I need, right? And then you run a rake and it says, I can't find that gem. Because it's looking in the Ruby 1.9 repository. So that's just sort of something to watch out for, basically. What I did is I copied the bin file for rake over, and then reinstalled it in the Ruby 1.8 version, so that I had the original executable again. So I have rake and then rake 1.9. But like I said, that little things like that there can be kind of annoying running both. Okay. Cool. Thanks, guys.
That concludes this episode of the SD.RB podcast. See you next time.